be hearing from a former Israeli spy who says Jeffrey Epstein and Ghi-laine Maxwell were blackmailing American politicians and public figures. And they were doing it for Israeli military intelligence. Here you've got a former Israeli military intelligence person, a senior spy, not just a run-of-the-mill spy, someone who's been in the intelligence ranks of the world for over 4 decades, someone who gets how this game is played. A former military intelligence asset, not only an asset, I should say he was a spy handler, one of the biggest spy handlers for military intelligence. He's no longer there with them. He's the real deal. His name is Ari Ben Menashe. You might recognize the name because he was a big deal in Iran-Contra, I would say. Maybe not in the best way, but from his arrival, Pollard, Promise, all these other things that happened, Iran-Contra, Israel's very aggressive stance on using its secret service around the world, has led some to believe that we've reached the point of no return almost. The bottom line is this guy was the real deal operator back then. It's during that time, and we're talking about 1980, early 1980s, that he met Jeffrey Epstein. And he met Jeffrey Epstein because he was introduced to Jeffrey Epstein by Robert Maxwell.
You maintain that it was your employer, Robert Maxwell, owner of the Daily Mirror. You say that he was an Israeli agent, and as was his daughter.
He was not my employer. I would like to correct that.
Okay.
We worked together with him.
And you say that his daughter Ghi-laine also, though, worked for Israel, and it was Robert Maxwell who introduced Jeffrey Epstein to Ghi-laine Maxwell way before the 1990s, as mainstream media is reporting.
Correct.
I suppose what the most alarming allegations that you've been making are that the entire Epstein operation was a honey trap operation to entrap politicians, policymakers, celebrities, people in the media eye, basically to become Israel's assets.
Correct. That it became basically an intelligence operation to entrap different politicians around the world.
Now, he claims that Epstein and Maxwell were deliberately targeting politicians and public figures. They weren't just looking for compromising situations. If they wanted just run-of-the-mill dirty photos of a celebrity or a politician doing something they shouldn't have done, they could have got it in many other ways. What's so interesting about what they did is they specifically went after minors, underage girls mostly, and targeted them. And then they tried to get these politicians, lure them in, get them compromised with these underage girls. In the old world, they used to say that the honey trap was the oldest trick in the book. But this isn't even a honey trap. This is a honey trap that's actually a criminal trap. That's a crime trap. It's a felony that they're trying to get these people on. And, if you're going to do that, if you're going to try so hard to get politicians in that kind of situation, you're going to want them to do some pretty big things for you, right? You're not going to just need that leverage if it's just asking for a donation to your charity. No, you're going to need that leverage because you're going to ask them to do some pretty big stuff. At least that's what you'd think would be happening. Otherwise, why would you spend the money? Why would you spend the time to pay for these girls, to go and find them, to discover them, to groom them? Why would you do that unless you had some big intention in mind?
I would ask Mr. Dershowitz to also address the topic of Zev Shalev at Narrative, the Israeli-born former CBS News executive producer, and Whitney Webb, who have reported that Jeffrey Epstein was being run by Israeli military intelligence as disclosed by Ari Ben Menashe.
We've been able to prove through multiple sources that Epstein is Israeli military intelligence. But, Alex Acosta was pretty clear when he was asked by the Trump transition team whether or not there would be any difficulty with his confirmation because of the Epstein case, because of what had happened in the Epstein case. He told them this. He had been told to cut a non-prosecution deal with Epstein's lawyers in 2008. Now, he had been told to back off, that Epstein was above his pay grade. I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone.
To suggest even that Israel was behind Epstein's entire career. It was none other than Alex Acosta, Trump's now resigned labor secretary, who said when he was in charge of the plea deal over Epstein, he said he belonged to intelligence. What do you think Acosta meant by that?
He said, it's not going to cause us problems because I was told to back off, that Epstein was above my pay grade, and that he's some sort of intelligence.
Great. But when Trump's former labor secretary, Acosta, says he belonged to intelligence, you think he means Israeli intelligence, not U.S. intelligence?
Correct. I think he meant Israeli intelligence. That's right.
Epstein working for the Mossad. What intelligence agency would trust Jeffrey Epstein?
But we know, I know, because we've been able to track this down, that Jeffrey Epstein was an agent for military intelligence in Israel. We know this. And when you look at that, it certainly lines up with what Mr. Acosta is telling the Trump transition team. He said they were intelligence and to leave him alone, and we know that Epstein was part of the intelligence community in Israel, part of military intelligence in Israel.
Jeffr-y Ep-tein and Ghi-laine Maxwell traveled in the same high-profile social circles as lovers and later as boss and employee. Prosecutors say for at least a decade, while out of the spotlight, the pair trafficked and abused girls.
And Ghi-laine Maxwell may well have been, if you like, his handler in that operation.
Ghi-laine Maxwell is Jeffrey Epstein's handler for the Israeli Mossad. I don't believe she works for him. He works for her. I think Jeffrey Epstein was recruited and given a position to pretend to be a billionaire. Jeffrey Epstein has never been a billionaire. He's never made any business deals himself. He was allowed to pretend to be a billionaire, and his job was to entrap influential Americans and Brits and others around the world, entrap them in sex scandals with underage teenage girls so that they could be blackmailed. So his job was pretend to be a billionaire and entrap influential people. His salary was unlimited access to teenage girls. And he got to use all of the company benefits, right? The mansions, the jets,
Cars.
He could pretend to be a billionaire. Everybody thought he was a billionaire. But he knew he's not a billionaire. He's working for the company. Who's the company? Zionism, Israel, Mossad. What's the plan? Entrap influential Americans and others in Great Britain and Europe.
Many are saying that this may have been a front for some sort of blackmailing operation. Even one of Epstein's alleged victims, Victoria Jeffrey, one of his accusers, said this. She said he got girls for Epstein's friends and acquaintances. Epstein specifically told me that the reason for him doing this was that so they would, quote, owe him, and he would, quote, have something on them. So this is leading some to speculate that he may have been part of some bigger intelligence operation.
I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that even royalty were involved.
In a 2015 affidavit, Jeffrey claimed Epstein told her he set up his friends with minors so that they would owe him. They would be in his pocket and he would have something on them. Jeffrey also said that Ghi-laine Maxwell had a large collection of child pornography that she had made of the underage girls. She also says that Epstein required her to describe sex with these politicians, bankers, and celebrities that she was directed to have sex with, presumably so that he could potentially blackmail them.
And she showed me. She had passports. Get this. I don't know how this is legal. A French passport, an English passport, an Israeli passport, an American passport, and there was one other.
Get your passport to the ocean. So you will have 2 passports.
And I was like, I thought you were only allowed to be citizen like of 2 countries or something. I didn't know. And she's like, oh, no, because of my dad. I'm a citizen of all these nations. I know for a fact Epstein had an Israeli passport because he showed me.
I want all of our viewers to hear about this. The last witness of the day, an FBI agent. She was talking about raiding Epstein's mansion here in New York City in July of 2019. She talked about what exactly they found inside. She said that they found binders full of images and CDs and hard drives. She said were also tucked away in closets. We also found out that they actually were able to find a huge blue safe. Inside of that, they found cash, passports, loose jewelry, including more binders filled with CDs and more hard drives.
First house I go to has pinhole cameras. Jeffrey's showing me. He's really proud of them. Second house I go to has pinhole cameras. He says, Wexner gave me this house for $1. Wexner gave me this for $1. He keeps everything. He records it all. He said, I record everything. Keep it for Wexner in the safe. The head of the snake is Les Wexner.
How did Jeff Epstein make that much money? And he actually, the reports are, at least, that Mr. Wexner gave him this really expensive townhouse here.
Yeah. And then also, don't forget, he also transferred the jet over, a Boeing 727.
But it really raises a question.
Well, Wexner is Israeli intelligence, 100%. Ghi-laine answers to Wexner. I know that for a fact. It was a sign that she would be under him. And I know that's where she got all of her funding to do this scam with Epstein. I know that. And it's all out of Israel.
Wexner gave Epstein extraordinary access to his finances, evidenced by a 1991 court filing in Franklin County that gave Epstein power of attorney.
Also today, a banker testified. He was talking about many transactions between Epstein and Maxwell. We found out within 3 separate transactions that Epstein actually transferred Maxwell about $30 million. We found out from that banker that Maxwell spent about $7.3 million of those dollars on a green helicopter.
Use children.
Or both.
That's of course
or both.
possible.
He could be a sick individual who was used perhaps by either foreign, as a foreign asset.
That's a good point.
Or a CIA asset.
That's a good point. But
right?
It does stink of a more professional blackmailing operation when you talk about how big this thing really was. And let's bring it back to that controversial plea deal, right, from Alex Acosta, who was the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida at the time, who, as we know, resigned Friday. He said, even he himself said, I was told Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone. So this has led some to question, okay, intelligence asset for who? So let me take you to Robert Steele, who's a former CIA and military intelligence officer.
Okay.
This is his statement. He says, I remain of the view that Jeffrey Epstein is a Mossad clandestine operations officer, assisted by Mossad clandestine operations officer Ghi-laine Maxwell, and that their mission is to do precisely what they have been doing, entrap U.S. politicians, judges, celebrities, prosecutors, and corporate leaders.
And most governments will do this if they could. It just so happens the Israelis are really good at it.
Right. I mean, what could be a better asset than someone who has all this dirt, right? This quote-unquote blackmail on a lot of powerful players. And even Philip Giraldi, who's also a former CIA and military intelligence officer, said this. He said, here's how it would have gone if it were true. Mossad would have exploited Epstein's contacts, arranging their cooperation by having Epstein wining and dining them while flying them off to exotic locations, providing them with women and entertainment. If they refused to cooperate, it'd be time for blackmail, photos and videos of sex with underage women.
So the idea would be that any powerful man, be he tycoon, prime minister, prince, or former president or present president, if somebody was to say to them, I have video of you with a 14-year-old girl.
You do whatever they wanted.
You own them.
Right.
They are now
theory.
Officially owned in theory. And this is the concern in a case like this because it involves so many. Stay where you are. Let's bring in Ben Swan. Ben, you've been listening to the conversation. What sayeth you?
Well, first of all, you guys are touching on some really important points. This Maxwell connection is kind of shocking. If you really take a look at what's going on with it, Robert Maxwell, the billionaire from the UK who owned a newspaper empire there have been allegations and claims for many years. He died in 1991, by the way, in a completely bizarre way. He was standing naked on his yacht named after his daughter, and then jumped in or fell into the ocean near the Canary Islands and either drowned or had a heart attack, and there isn't even a clear cause of death for him. The claims have been made over the years that he was Mossad. In fact, the British Foreign Office believed that he was absolutely a double agent, and they believed that he was Mossad.
Will he ask the Prime Minister, as head of the Security and Intelligence Services, to order an immediate inquiry into the alleged relationship between the Israeli intelligence service and Robert Maxwell.
So if he was Mossad, possibly, it's also possible that his daughter is connected to Mossad, and that's how she's connected to Epstein, because the two have been together for years, but don't seem to have any relationship other than her being his fixer, which is a very strange relationship for the daughter of a billionaire to take.
Adding something to what you're talking about right now, Maxwell was essentially his only partner, client?
Right, so the daughter of Robert Maxwell, Ghi-laine Maxwell, pretty much acted as this recruiter and even sometimes a participant in this sexual abuse. But I think Ben is absolutely hitting the nail on the head. We have this father of his partner in crime with very strong ties to Mossad, who's been accused of being an Israeli agent by many journalists, including Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh. And in a book called Robert Maxwell, Israel's Super Spy, that actually really details both his life and death, a very strong case is made for the fact that he was actually assassinated by the Mossad after he became a liability.
She told me, she said he was such an important person for Israel that they gave him a state funeral, and she went on and on and on about his funeral ceremony, and she showed me pictures of like what a big deal it was. And she said they murdered him, that Israel murdered him.
I think that it could have been that he was murdered.
But here's something interesting, Rick, that because I know how you like to go down this rabbit hole, right? Think about this. Robert Maxwell, after he died, he is a British citizen, was given a state funeral in Israel. The prime minister got up and said that he had done much more for Israel than anyone could ever know this day during his eulogies.
He was then buried with full Israeli state honors on the Mount of Olives, buried by the president and the prime minister of Israel, and no less than 7 serving or former heads of the Mossad. So it's quite clear that Robert Maxwell did perform what the president of Israel called at the funeral extraordinary service for Israel. Of course, exactly what that service was buried with him on the Mount of Olives. Question now, Rick, was Ghi-laine Maxwell very like her father indeed? Was she performing an extraordinary service? And if so, by whom?
Robert Maxwell was clearly tied in ways to the state of Israel that go far beyond what the average person would be, even the average billionaire. He was connected very, very heavily to that.
And Robert Maxwell was the spy master, or at least the spy that Ari Ben-Menashe was handling. And if you talk about famous spies in Israel's history or any history, Ari Ben-Menashe's guy, Robert Maxwell, was about the biggest as you can get. He was a famous British publisher. He ran the Daily Mirror. He was larger than life in many ways. He also maybe leaked very sensitive information to the Russians and to the Israelis. But these guys were big deal intelligence assets, and he landed up becoming much more of an asset for the Israelis, and in fact died maybe at the hands of Mossad, who many people say he had crossed the line. He was threatening to reveal some of the secrets, and he just became uncontrollable.
And they've admitted to the public that they took over Robert Maxwell's spying records, operations, and moved that to Florida, to Jeffrey Epstein's house. That's been admitted. That's a fact.
And it was Robert Maxwell, the famous spy, who introduced Ari Ben-Menashe to Jeffrey Epstein, who introduced Jeffrey Epstein to Israeli military intelligence in Israel, and who introduced all of them to a very different world.
As for his daughter, in terms of her involvement, again, her relationship to Epstein is so important because, again, here's a woman who seems to go around and recruit these girls for him and gets nothing out of it. Other than to be like kind of his partner in crime. The black book that Epstein has the names of so many, and not just in the United States. We're talking about U.S. politicians. We're talking about, again, his relationship with people like Prince Andrew. The king of Saudi Arabia, King bin Salman, is in that book. So he's connected to people all over the world, and people with whom the Israelis would want to connect.
They've been involved in our stealing our technology for many, many years. But another way that Israel has affected U.S. foreign policy is through blackmail operations. And I would point to Jeffrey Epstein, who was allowed for 30 years to recruit young girls in America from vulnerable, broken homes, as young as 13 years old. And Mr. Epstein, who I believe was a fake billionaire, I do not believe he was a billionaire. I believe he was an actor, an imposter on behalf of the Israeli Mossad. Mr. Epstein then lured powerful, influential American men into his various mansions so that they could rape the girls. The sexual acts were videotaped, and the videos were sent to Israel for blackmail operations against Americans.
If it were proven, what would the U.S. establishment do?
Nothing. Nothing. Too many American leaders have been videotaped by Jeffrey Epstein. There's not going to be any action from the American political establishment. The American ruling class is corrupt, and the American people must clean house.
I want to thank you, Democrats and Republicans, for your common support for Israel, year after year, decade after decade.
Both parties, both political parties in America are controlled by Zionists. There is no choice in America.
Epstein and Maxwell were both Israeli spies working for Israeli military intelligence, and that they were running a blackmail scheme here in our country, in North America, targeting our politicians, our scientists, our academics. And they were doing it for military intelligence in Israel.
Would you say she was an agent as well? Was she someone working for Israeli intelligence?
Oh, definitely.
Military intelligence as well?
Yes. These guys were seen as agents. And so they found a niche for themselves, blackmailing American and other political figures.
For the Israelis? So it's hard for people to understand why Israel would want to get blackmail on an American. I'm asking a question that I can answer it probably, but for most people it's hard for them to think about Israel as being blackmailing their leaders in the United States. It's a very...
It was quite their MO. He made sure these girls were underage. You really didn't want the stories to come out about how they were blackmailing American politicians.
No.
Ghi-laine said they were working on all these Israeli charities. And I remember thinking, oh, that's weird. And she was like, you don't understand our loyalty to Israel, Maria. You don't understand our loyalty.